I'm Kathleen Martins, a reporter with APTN News. Homeless, houseless, shelterless people, they aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? Hear their stories in my new 5-part podcast called Our Relatives. Listen on your favorite player.
Tonight on Nation to Nation, the RCMP is just one example where reconciliation has failed, says a Hill Times columnist.
Numerous reports around racism towards Indigenous peoples, a lack of services. There's been no consequence at all.
Not all doom and gloom. A Toronto Metropolitan University project says awareness about reconciliation is becoming more positive.
Non-Indigenous respondents beginning to align a little bit more in their perceptions of reconciliation with Indigenous respondents.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford's killing of a climate action plan faces a legal challenge led by 7 youth.
They violated youth and future generations' rights under the Charter to life, to security of the person, and to equality because Ontario's target commits to a dangerous level of emissions.
Ani Bojo, hello, I'm Annette Francis and welcome to Nation to Nation. Reconciliation is a word that's been heard often over the years, ever since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report and 94 calls to action. That was 8 years ago. Is it actually happening? According to Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay, not really. She joins me now. Welcome, Rose LeMay.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
According to the Yellowhead report, of the 94 calls to action, 81 remain. With all the talk of reconciliation, how is it that only 13 calls have been acted on?
It's a really good question. I don't think there are any nice answers. Governments do have a lot of responsibility for many of the calls, not all of them. And my fear is that governments, federal government included, provinces and territories, haven't really put this reconciliation as a priority. Funding hasn't gone to it. Human resources haven't been tagged to reconciliation. So not much action has actually been completed by governments.
The title of your latest column is Why is Reconciliation Stalling in Federal Departments? Did reconciliation even start in those places?
Well, I would guess that some people would say it hasn't started. I was really intrigued by the Minister Mark Miller when he left Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations Department. And his comment was that he was surprised in the amount of resistance from within departments to reconciliation. Did it really get started? I think there was some good attempts. I don't doubt that numerous leaders have tried to make it happen, but I actually want to put a focus on unions. For all the talk of solidarity, why aren't unions prioritizing reconciliation and prioritizing reconciliation for their members?
How can unions play a big role in that?
Unions have played significant roles in the past in the making of what we now call Canada, in terms of giving their support, their weight to issues of solidarity, of human rights. I'm surprised that while at the beginning of the TRC calls to action in 2015, some unions made some small moves towards it. Unions really haven't moved beyond a bit of a performative approach. And so I want to see them actually take more of a lead in this. They can be change makers. It's time they actually did some leading.
The last line of that column, you ask why there has been no consequences to civil servants who stall reconciliation. What should happen there?
Well, I can think of numerous leaders who should have actually met some consequence. The RCMP has numerous reports against it. And yes, I do include this within the overall federal suite. Numerous reports around racism towards Indigenous peoples, a lack of services. There's been no consequence at all. Public safety really stalled out on funding First Nations policing to an equitable and reasonable amount. Not a lot of consequence. We talk about consequence being the vote. But I think Indigenous needs and equity shouldn't go to a vote. This is a question of morality. This is a question of human rights. It's not up to the voting public. So where are the consequences? I'm not really sure. None has happened, but when Canadians' lives, when Indigenous lives are at risk due to a lack of service from governments, I think there should be consequence.
You mentioned also that there's been no call to action in response to the unmarked graves found at residential schools in 2021. What's it going to take to see action there?
Wow, I don't know. I really expected more consistent action since the findings from BC and then all across the country and across Turtle Island. I thought there'd be more action. And I often wonder why this hasn't received more international response. Now, this government tends to say, no, this is not an international issue, but human rights actually is an international issue. And I wonder if there needs to be some consequential international response to this in order to force the governments to act. But I also call on provinces and territories. They should be really stepping up more than they are. Reconciliation is something that lays on all of our shoulders. So provinces and territories can't opt out of this.
Do you think the federal government is waiting for Bill C-29 to pass, which will fulfill calls to action numbers 53 to 56 and create a National Reconciliation Council? Will this council be effective?
I don't know if it can be effective given the proposed structure of it. The only effect that external leaders or people or advisories can have is when they have the legal responsibility of like an ombudsperson, only when they have the right to access all the data and information, which an external advisory will not have. Only when they have the right to call a minister, call a deputy minister to task, can they actually enforce some difference. An external advisory won't have that. So it relies on the strength of relationship. And that is not what human rights should rely on. Human rights needs to rely on the strength of the law, not in relationship.
Prime Minister Trudeau doesn't say the most important relationship to him is with Indigenous people as much these days. Is that a telling sign that reconciliation isn't on the mind of the federal government?
Well, I would guess that what is top of mind for the Prime Minister at this point is the next election. And while it could be seen, it's not a surprise. It's worrying that other parties actually are not talking about reconciliation. What are the Conservatives saying? What are the NDP saying? This is not a party platform. This is a human rights issue. It's a matter of law. And so it concerns me that only one party wants to uphold the law and ensure equity for First Nations children and child welfare, to ensure First Nations policing have the resources that every other municipal policing force would have. This is a matter of human rights. It's not a political issue.
Wab Kinew is still relatively a new First Nations Premier of Manitoba. Will he be able to move the needle on reconciliation in that province?
I believe Wab Kinew has already moved the needle, and I think I don't know how far he can go with it, but wow, am I ever excited to watch, as I'm guessing a lot of Indigenous peoples are. Indigenous peoples, when we lead, we're not just doing it for Indigenous peoples, we're doing it for all Canadians. And so to see Indigenous peoples front and center in Manitoba now is just truly amazing. And I have so much respect for him.
Okay. Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Donlashish.
Next, we'll hear more about reconciliation and how to measure its progress. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, host of Face to Face. Coming up on our next episode, I'll be sitting down with Anishinaabe lawyer Sarah Mainville. We'll be discussing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and why Mainville thinks there are misconceptions around UNDRIP when it should be viewed as an opportunity. Tune in Tuesday on APTN or listen to the Face to Face podcast. Download and subscribe on your favorite player.
Anine, welcome back. According to our next guest, reconciliation is progressing. Alordanan Efimov is an assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University. She's involved in a research project that measures the progress of public perception to reconciliation. It's called the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer. She joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
So, what is a reconciliation barometer?
That is a great question. A reconciliation barometer is an attempt to measure perceptions or progress toward reconciliation, usually on a societal level.
What is the purpose of it?
So, the purpose of a reconciliation barometer is to track progress towards reconciliation, usually across time, with the long-term goal of ensuring that we are on the right track and continually moving toward reconciliation.
This barometer resulted in a report in 2022 and an update more recently. What was the most surprising conclusion of that?
That is a great question. So there were, of course, a lot of results in both of the reports that we've released so far. The most recent, we collected data in 2022 and released the report in 2023. I would say maybe the most surprising thing has been that we've seen some movement in as little time as a year. So, a lot of the things that we're measuring in the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer are big scale societal things that take a long time to move. We know reconciliation is a long term project, it's going to take a long time. But despite it being a long term project, we have seen some movement in terms of non Indigenous respondents beginning to align a little bit more in their perceptions of reconciliation with Indigenous respondents. So it's been kind of a pleasant surprise to see that alignment coming.
Where were some of those respondents from? Do you know the areas?
Yeah, so the respondents, we had quotas for 6 different regions in so-called Canada. So we included participants from the North, which was just kind of broadly anyone in Northern so-called Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, British Columbia, the Prairies, which included Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes.
Is there anything that Indigenous people would find disappointing in this report?
I think so. I think the fact that we are not seeing more progress towards reconciliation is certainly disappointing as an Indigenous person. Specifically, that we're seeing things like systemic equality and personal equality still being things that we're seeing the least progress on. So that I think is definitely a disappointing finding. But there's some maybe more positive findings as well that do help to give us a little bit of hope.
Before the break, we spoke with the Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay, who describes reconciliation as stalling at the federal level. Does your research come to a similar conclusion?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, our barometer doesn't specifically look at different levels of government. And I do think some other kind of measures of reconciliation in Canada do reflect this idea that there's a stall, right? When we look at the lack of progress on the calls to action released from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But where we might see some reflection of that is in the systemic inequity questions we have on our barometer. And indeed, we've seen that that is one of the areas that participants see the least progress in, which might reflect this idea that there's some stalling happening at a systemic level.
The Yellowhead Institute released its 2023 update on reconciliation, and of the 94 calls to action, 13 have been acted upon. Is there a measurement in your study on the priority areas the general public needs to be made aware about?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely areas that need more work, and those areas are, um, maybe things that the general public, the non-Indigenous public in particular, might not think about super often. So things like systemic inequality or inequity that Indigenous people often experience in Canada, but also things like nation-to-nation relationships that I think the general public might not often think about. Indigenous people might think about those things, but the general non-Indigenous population might not. as well as things like how we're reconciling with the natural world. Are we in a respectful relationship with the natural world that surrounds us? It's something else I think sometimes people aren't thinking about, but is an important part of reconciliation.
According to Yellowhead, there's been no call to action in the response to the unmarked graves found at residential schools in 2021, which made headlines at the time. How much of a lasting effect did that have on the Canadian public, do you think?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we noted in our most recent report when comparing last year's report to our current report is that there's been a huge increase um, ed- in the knowledge of residential schools among respondents in Canada. And we think a large part of that increase in knowledge of residential schools might be due to the discovery or the finding of those unmarked graves and the publicizing of those unmarked graves across the country. So there's the potential that that's created some lasting awareness of residential schools. Of course, we didn't test that specifically, but that's something we suspect is kind of an outcome of that media presence around that discoveries or those findings.
So what is the future of this project?
Yeah, the future of the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer, I would say ideally we're going to be tracking progress towards reconciliation for many years to come so that we can eventually have, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year progress marks so that we can really try to hold different institutions in this country accountable to reconciliation, to promises that have been made, to the calls to action, to UNDRIP, to all of these guiding documents to make sure that we're staying on track and we're still creating momentum to work towards reconciliation broadly.
How can you get the Canadian public on board in educating them on reconciliation to gain more support for more action?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great question. I think it's something that, I'm speaking a bit with my experience outside of the project as, someone who studies social psychology. And I think there's, a few different things that we can do to try to get the public more on board. So some of those include messaging, right? Out in the public, whether that's advertisements on transportation, whatever it may be, public art installations to raise awareness of reconciliation, the importance of reconciliation. Another piece is media coverage. I think media coverage and representation in the media and popular culture can have a really big influence on the general public. And the last would be creating individual relationships among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And that might look like, providing some guidance to non-Indigenous people about what their role in reconciliation is. There's a lot of uncertainty around what the role of non-Indigenous people is. So providing guidance there, I think, could help as well.
Okay, thank you, Miigwech, for joining us.
Hawa, thank you.
Stick around. After the break, we'll hear from a lawyer who's representing youth that are taking legal action against the Ontario Premier's climate change targets.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.
Anine, welcome back. 7 Ontario youth, 3 of them from First Nations, continue to fight against the Ontario government's stance on climate targets. It's a legal case that began in 2019 in response to Premier Doug Ford's 2018 Cap and Trade Cancellation Act. That put an end to ex-provincial Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne's goal to lower greenhouse gases in Ontario by putting caps on the amount of pollution companies could emit. The youth say that the province is violating their charter rights to life, liberty, and security of person. Canada's largest law charity continues to defend their claim. Danielle Gallant is a lawyer with Eco Justice. She joins me now. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you.
Your clients are suing the Ontario government for, in their words, weakening climate targets. How is this a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and why?
So our youth applicants are arguing that when the Ontario government made the decision to backtrack on its climate ambition and to set a 2030 climate target that is completely out of line with science, they violated youth and future generations' rights under the Charter to life, to security of the person, and to equality, because Ontario's target commits to a dangerous level of emissions, which are in line with catastrophic levels of impacts in the province.
This challenge has had some setbacks over the years. The Ontario Superior Court dismissed the application, but it wasn't all bad. The judge also found the case is justified. What else was acknowledged by the judge, and what could it mean for the appeal?
So that's absolutely right. Despite the fact that the overall result of the decision was that the case was dismissed, there were some really important findings within that decision. The first important finding were that the judge fully endorsed climate science. She accepted that climate change is real, it's happening, it's causing harmful impacts to Ontarians, it disproportionately impacts young people and Indigenous peoples, and that the world needs to seriously reduce emissions in order to limit global warming, in order to avoid the worst impacts. The judge also found that Ontario's target is increasing the risks of harm and death to Ontarians because it is so far out of line with science. And so these are very important findings that we will continue building on in this appeal.
The argument was heard recently at the Ontario's Court of Appeal. How confident are you about a win?
I think we're feeling, quite good about how the hearing went. It was also just a very important moment for our clients, our youth, the 7 youth involved in this case, because it was their first actual time in a courtroom. The 2 previous hearings had been virtual during the pandemic. And so I think, the experience that they had actually being in the courtroom, seeing the judges, seeing the lawyers was incredibly important. And I think that we left that hearing feeling like it reflected the urgency of this crisis, that the arguments made reflected that this is an existential threat. And so we hope that the courts will agree with us on that.
How soon do you expect to hear a decision from the Court of Appeal?
So we don't know exactly when we will receive a decision. It could take as long as a year, and it could come out as soon as in 4 months. And so given the urgency of the issue in front of us, I'm hoping that it'll come out earlier rather than later.
What would a win mean for Canada, science, and the environment?
I think a win in this case would be very significant, both on the legal side, because it would be the first time in Canada that a government would be held accountable for its climate target being inadequate and in fact dangerous. Obviously, it would also, just the fact of holding a government accountable on the basis of the charter would mean that other governments in Canada would receive the message that they also can be held accountable by people in those provinces or in the country. And so I think it would set a really important legal precedent, but also be very significant throughout the country, and also for the public to be aware that what Ontario is doing is unconstitutional and violates young people's rights.
How old are the 7 individuals you're representing, and what is it that makes them stand out?
So the young people involved in this case, when we launched, were between 12 and 24, and I believe they're now between 16 and 28. And they all have their own reasons for being involved in this case, but what unites them is the fact that they're all very concerned about climate change and the impacts that it is already having and will continue to have, and also that their government is not merely backing away from the problem, but actually actively causing increased harm. And so, that's one reason that unites them, but they're also all leaders in their respective communities. They've all been taking action before this lawsuit, during this lawsuit. They will likely continue after as well, and show leadership in their own communities on climate impacts. And so, they're truly respective leaders on the climate front.
What are you hearing from Canadians about the case?
I think a lot of people find it empowering that young people are rising up and going through the court system to hold their governments accountable. We've also seen more and more cases like this being launched both in Canada and throughout the world. And so the young people involved in this case are part of this kind of global movement to hold governments and other actors accountable for the climate crisis. And so I think we've received a lot of messages of encouragement, and that they're thankful that these young people are showing this leadership and bringing Ontario to court.
Okay. How can Canadians support you and the youth in this cause?
I'd say keep amplifying the messages that these youth are bringing forward in this case. Keep amplifying their voices, because I think it's very significant that youth are the ones who are bringing this case, because it's their generation and the ones that will follow that will bear the brunt of climate impacts. And so, continue putting pressure on your governments at every level to listen to young people and their voices, and to do something about climate change, because the alternative is just unacceptable.
Okay. Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
That's it for tonight's episode of Nation to Nation. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Miigwech, and have a good evening.